Welcome to the worst of the best podcast. You wanted the best. They didn't freaking make it! So here's what you get. From Canada, Ryan
and Tony.
We'd like to welcome to the show, Tony. It's really good having you here today. I think the last time that you and I podcasted together was when you were a guest on, was it Donald Trump?
Yeah, it was the top 10 Trump scandals. And I think that was in like 2019. So, boy, howdy, has the bar been raised on that. I think we were just talking about, oh yeah, he said some off-color things, he did that, and now it's like, giving nuclear secrets to the Saudi. How much 3 years has made a difference in that one?
It was an absolute pleasure having you on the show and having you a part of the podcast and having you as a guest host. And I hope we do this again. But yeah, your show, One Big Toilet, that's a show that I'm going to definitely miss. I loved your take on politics, even though I'm a Canadian. I loved your take on politics. And just like every good show, you don't have to agree with everyone to also get a good feel of who they are, of their heart, of their intent. And I always say, Tony, you should run for politician position. But yeah, always enjoyed your show, and it's going to be sorely missed, absolutely sorely missed on my part.
Thank you so much for the kind words. Yeah, it was just for me is that I've reached like a point, like it's only that like I'm a secular person, right? I'm an atheist, but I'm saying like spiritually in an abstract sense is that I just reached a point where I really want to, like I've been saying a lot that the internet's not fun anymore. A lot of that's like to the proliferation of disinformation and misinformation on Facebook and social media. I felt, especially, I feel like also like the tide and where everything is going, I've been vindicated. So I feel that like I don't need to be saying, I think everything I felt that I needed to say has been said. And we're just moving into a new paradigm. And I'm just more willing to see how things play out. Really, I want to do more fun things. If I'm going to do like a podcast stuff, I'd rather just show up on a show now and talk about something that brings me joy as opposed to having to read the news and being like, I want to jump off a bridge.
Then I'm very honored and privileged you decided to come on my show, or that you agreed to take the invitation to come on my show and guest host on this episode. Thank you for coming out of retirement, so to speak, and sitting on the show there, Tony.
Yeah, no, and plus I said, it's just anytime you ask, it's like in the Gamma Gator circle, Ryan is a perennial favorite of everybody else because he's just genuinely the nicest. You're just genuinely one of the most mentally healthy human beings I've ever encountered in my entire life. And you have such a joie de vivre around you that it's so great to be on the show. Because I said, every time I'm on it for a few months, I'm like, when you're doing guest spots, especially, not aside from your show, but like when like you get on like No Redeeming Qualities or this or that, it's just liven up the room, you liven up the spirit. So it's always fun to come on and chit chat with you, and whatever we're talking about, it's a fun ride. It's a mental treat.
With those kind of words, how can I resist? I'm going to have you on again, and I know there will be some topics and things that I know you'll enjoy talking about that I will reach out to you and have you guest on again. So when that call comes, will you accept coming on the show again?
Oh, anytime.
One such call came out just now, of course, to you about wrestling, because I knew by listening to your podcast, the now defunct and unfortunately defunct One Big Toilet, that you are a wrestling fan, and I thought, who better to call than you? And you accepted the call to come on and talk about the 90s wrestlers. When you got that call from me to do this, what was your response? Editor's note, dear listeners, you're going to hear Tony's voice crackle. We acknowledge this mistake or this issue as the podcast went on. We made some arrangements, so just bear with us. It's not going to be for the whole hour and a half, 2 hours of this podcast. It is dealt with, but just be patient. It will be dealt with naturally throughout the interview.
I dropped through the rafters like Sting just to be like, yes! Like, because this is genuinely a subject near and dear to my heart. I think that I've said before is that what I consider the three greatest American contributions to the society at large is jazz music, labor union, and professional wrestling. It's something that I've followed. Ironically enough, I don't watch it on TV weekly. I try to keep abreast of what's going on like in wrestling, but like I really am enamored with the history behind it all and like the backstage stuff, especially because it's like especially in the pre what they call kayfabe era. Kayfabe. So for the uninitiated, kayfabe is the art of pretending that what's going on in the ring is not predetermined. It's the lore, if you will. It's the story itself. There's this whole like interesting history behind how wrestling went from actually a legitimate competition to this scripted competition and the lifestyles they lived to maintain this illusion, mainly just to make a lot of money. It was like for years, I think wrestling changed from a business.
It definitely is a huge business. I don't know if it's the same as it used to be or what have you, but definitely wrestling is big. You got other AEW or AEW. You've got, of course, WWE and other independent circuits that are even quite popular. So wrestling definitely is a business, and by all means, it's allowed to make money. But back when I was watching wrestling, of course, it was very simple. It was just the WWE or WWF at the time, and there's just the good guys, and then there's just the bad guys. It was very black and white. It didn't become more gray the way it is now with characters.
It was good guy, bad guy, yeah.
Speaking of old school wrestling, of course, I was 8 years old when WrestleMania 3 came out. That's when, of course, Andre went heel, as they say, became a bad guy, and tore off the necklace off Hulk Hogan. That was always a fun memory. But one of my favorite matches, of course, was, the Ricky Steamboat Macho Man fight in WrestleMania. I think it was 3 as well, but what an incredible fight that was.
Incredible match.
Now, there might be people listening to this episode right now thinking, why are you guys talking about wrestling? I can't believe you guys are talking about wrestling. What's the big deal about it? It's fake. It's not fake in the sense of a soap opera. That's fake. This is real athleticism in the ring. These are real, basically you're watching live stunt work. You ever go to, of course, you go to Disney World or Universal Studios, you see these stunt actors doing stunt work. It's a show, it's predetermined, it's a script, but they're performing live, and these guys are incredible athletes. There's still a lot of ring calls or stuff that's called in the ring, but the amount of footwork and handwork and coordination and, of course, athleticism is amazing. The match is predetermined. The winner's predetermined, but there's a lot that goes in these matches.
I was going to add to that is that I think what's also important to acknowledge is, yes, the outcomes are predetermined. No matter what you do, it hurts. This still hurts. It's a very interesting storytelling vehicle, especially now, I think, as we have what they call smart fans, is that as kayfabe has disappeared, we get to appreciate, I think that's why wrestling is in such a healthy spot it is today, is because people aren't watching it. And they even make a joke is that even in back of the day is that people tacitly, little children, not really, but people tacitly acknowledge that this was like a show, right? And it's like a magic show. You know, it's not real. You're there to enjoy the spectacle. Now that everybody's smartened up to it, like we really appreciate the spectacle and how everything is done. And people like actually begin to study and understand the intricacies and the finesse. So I remember, like I said, I was 2 for WrestleMania 3. I can like barely remember that. I don't remember that at all. But as I became like a cognizant being, I was like aware of wrestling in the 80s. But really, for me, it really capped off late 90s Attitude Era when I was a teen. And that's what you said. It's funny you talk about how you became a teen and you fell off. But then like I was at that age where they're like, we're going to stop trying to market this to kids and we're going to market this teenagers, college students, and Howard Stern listeners. I was in that, especially as a kid as like a latchkey kid who, you know, being raised by 2 working parents or 2 working single parents, joint custody. Like wrestling was like a godsend. And then also I was also like a Stern fan because it's like the round age. Really, all these interests of mine were like coalescing, and wrestling at that time was arguably, if you actually watch it, nobody remembers anything that happened in the ring. Really, people don't remember the ring stuff. The actual wrestling, and there was some amazing wrestling going on because the in-ring talent, but like what you remember are like the vignettes and the stunts and the gimmicks more than anything in the 90s. And I think right now is that same thing. I fell off for a few years and I got back into it, and then I started learning about the history and things like that. And now I try to appreciate it from a different level, like a different degree. And right now, where wrestling is, it's probably the most relevant it's ever been culturally. It's funny is that it's not as popular as it's ever been, but it's more relevant than ever because, like I said, people say babyface, heel, kayfabe, gimmick. We all have it. Growing up, did you crotch chop like this or did you crotch chop like this, right? Like we have like little things that it's super relevant on it. The biggest movie star in the world, we'll get to him later, but is that the biggest movie star in the world was a professional wrestler. And like where he developed the persona that he made him the most marketable man in Hollywood was through his promos and things like that. And like wrestling is A great point, but to understand how it got there, we should talk about some of the people that made it what it is today.
Before we continue, I just want to give one of my favorite memories when I was a kid. Of course, it was when Hulk Hogan, and I'll probably mention this again, but of course when Hulk Hogan was portrayed by Andre the Giant, and it's just a young lad at the time, and Andre the Giant pulls on Hogan's necklace, and Hogan's bleeding a little bit from the scratch from Andre. And of course, Hogan works with that. It works with the bleeding. And there's that fine line back then. Is like, what was this? Was this a work, or was this kayfabe type thing? And when you're a kid, you didn't know what was real, what was fake. That was just amazing time back then to watch not behind the scenes, but the soap opera between every fight. You didn't know what was a work.
I was going to say, for the uninitiated, what the terms work and shoot is, when something is a work, that means that it was within the realm of kayfabe, that's actually part of the story. When something is a shoot, that's referring to them. So it's a work as in they're working the crowd. But if it's a shoot, that means they shot from the hip and they did something that wasn't scripted. And wrestling right now is in a current state, at least in AEW, where there's a lot of, is this a work? Is this a shoot? Kind of thing. And that it helps reassess your suspension of belief. Because even when you know you're being fooled, this is definitely not reality. They found a way to engage you. And that's what really always draws me to pro wrestling, is that it is this magic trick. It's a constant magic trick. And it's so fun, especially once if you just allow yourself, if you give yourself permission to be fooled, it's a wonderful thing.
So when I made the list, I have to admit that I just put the numbers or the wrestlers in random order. It wasn't necessarily in order of what was the greatest at number 10 or 11 or whatever. The number 1 was number 1. So anyways, I put the wrestlers list together, and I gave you odd or even, and I took odd or even or whatever it was. I can't remember now. But I have to admit, when I looked at the names that I had randomly, I was like, oh, I really like my list. I felt bad that you got the list you got. Are you okay with the list that you received?
I actually prefer the ones I have. Funnily enough, just last night, I just wanted to add this because I think it's hilarious. So we had this list, because a spoiler, one guy wasn't on it, and we had Ultimate Warrior, who's really more of an 80s guy, because this was supposed to be top wrestlers in the 90s. And Ultimate Warrior, and he really was also awful. He's actually just an awful wrestler. He was one of the worst in the ring, and he was also a god-awful human being out of it. You remember him because he looked cool. It was just this guy with this airbrushed hair and the face paint. He was jacked, and he ran to the ring. There's another wrestler who kind of, same thing. It was a very limited wrestler who just had a great look and a great entrance. People who really love Ultimate Warrior, don't love him because of what he did. They loved him because they were 5 and he looked rad,
All right, without further ado, let's get into it. I get to start with one of my favorite wrestlers, definitely from the 80s. I believe when we did the episode about 80s wrestlers, this individual, Macho Man Randy Savage, was a member of the 80s crew, but he also did some time in the 90s. I think people forget that he was influential, definitely inside the ring and inside the locker rooms for the younger generation coming up at the time, that Mr. Randy Savage was a wrestler to be spoken for, and certainly a wrestler even in the 90s to the late 90s. He was a presence in the ring. In 1992, for example, he won the WWF Championship against Ric Flair at WrestleMania 8, and then he held the title for 149 days. Until he left the WWE in 1994, Randy Savage offered the fans many vintage moments, such as his wedding at the SummerSlam 91 and the Cobra bite that he suffered when he was feuding with Jake Roberts. Some memorable stuff from Mr. Randy Savage. Your thoughts on Macho Man?
Yeah, I can't remember who, but I'm saying is that he had, in the early 90s, as this transition from big bodies, especially in the midst of the steroid scandal. And let's say, funny, I can say this, but I'm wearing a shirt, the Ico Pro, which was in the early 90s, was Vince McMahon was trying to start a bodybuilding federation. It went over like a wet fart. And then right in the middle of the steroids trial, he still had it, but he set up to have this line of supplements. The early Monday Night Raws, you just see these big Ico Pro banners. And Joe Henning, Curtis Axel, talked about how his dad, they used to just give him away for free backstage. And Curtis Axel drank a protein shake with it one time, and right before football practice, and then crapped his pants in football practice because it was so bad. So I just wanted to share that fun little tidbit. But what wasn't crapping their pants was Randy Savage was still on top of his game at this point and had some of the best matches of his career. The superplex is a move that is very ubiquitous at the time, but I think the first time anybody might have done it was Savage. when they did it, it blew the freaking roof off the place. It was like one of those, because it looks deadly as hell. But so these guys were pushing the envelope. Savage, it was like a consummate professional. I think he was one of the greatest in-ring technicians. If you really go back in the weeds, he was trying to do experimental promos in the early 80s before he moved to WWF, like when he was on like his dad's promotion. He was Randy Savage. He was never Randy Poffo, but like he did some wild stuff like in the early 80s. He's also, I think, one of the first people to do a table spot. And this is like before they gimmicked the table so they'd break. But he does a pile driver to, I think, Ricky Morton on a table on the outside of the ring. And it's supposed to be this like, oh my God, the dastardly Randy Savage. Look what he's doing. And then you see these three bros in the crowd who just get so hyped they start high-fiving one another. And this is like 83. Those guys, they were like the seeds for like ECW guys, like later in the ECW fans. Savage was, like, he's one of the guys you can say a lot of, and I don't think you give him enough praise. I think he's actually genuinely, as an in-ring person, he's one of the best to ever do a total package all around. And I think that he's a guy that there's a lot of people in the 80s that shouldn't be remembered, but I think Savage, even though he has a lot of flaws as a human being, should be regarded as one of the best to ever step foot in the ring. Yeah, he's one of the best. He's got his personal issues, but like I love him. And I think his intensity is one of the, to this day.
Awesome. Very well said. Boy, I love having you on the show, Tony. Your insight and your knowledge is amazing. And thank you for that great insight. Macho Man Randy Savage. Okay, who do you have next? What's next on our list here?
Woo! Ric Flair. 16-time world champion, but is actually 21 times. He has 5 world title reigns that aren't officially recognized by the World Wrestling Federation, WWE. Like, he dropped it a couple of times in like shows in the Dominican Republic because if they didn't hand over the title, there probably would have been a riot. So they're like, okay. So he has a lot of unofficial championships. Ric Flair, the limousine riding, jet flying, wheeling, dealing, kiss stealing, son of a gun. I think he's like the Casablanca of pro wrestlers, if that makes any sense. Like, he has such a long career. Like, he began in the 70s. He really hit his heyday in the 80s, but he was still highly relevant in the 1990s, especially 1992, when he jumped ship from WCW, where he spent most of his career in the southern markets, and then he jumped ship to WWF in 1991, 1992, because WCW never branded their titles, because they used the same one as the National Wrestling Alliance. So it was what's famously known as the Big Gold Belt from 1985 up till about 2014. He brought that championship with him because the world champion at the time had to pay a security deposit to ensure that they would get the belt back. And then also, funnily enough, though, is that particular belt has rubies inlaid in it. If you actually look at it, if you pay attention, the rubies slowly get bigger because people, when they would drop the title, would pry the rubies out of the belt and pawn them, because they would strip the hole. They'd have to put in a wider gauge of ruby. So by the tail end, it had significantly larger stones in it. That's one of the other reasons why they probably started doing security deposits on it. They wouldn't pay him a security deposit, so he's then technically the belt's still mine, and he brought it to WWF until WCW had a conniption and sued. But he was calling himself the real world's champion, and then he won the WWF title twice in 92 and the 1992 Royal Rumble, which is considered by and large the greatest Royal Rumble match of all time. He's got to be one of the best to have ever laced up a pair of boots. He just had what, quote unquote, his last match. He's got an alcohol problem and not the best father in the world. And right now he had this match, and I felt like if he kept it at this tag team match, like an exhibition tag team match with his son-in-law on Andre El Idolo, formerly known as, I can't remember his name in WWE, but the man who's currently married to his daughter Ashley, known as Charlotte in WWE, arguably, I think, probably the greatest wrestler wrestling today. Man or woman. I think that Charlotte might actually be the best wrestler in the business, period. He's doing things that it doesn't help that she's 6 feet tall and outweighs her competition by at least 40 pounds, but she's a phenom. So the greatest male wrestler begot probably the greatest female wrestler and the continuing part of his legacy. But he keeps on talking about doing a comeback. Lots of entertainers have undiagnosed trauma in their lives, right? To want to be like an entertainer, to need that kind of approval and validation from strangers, stems from some kind of Freudian something or other. Especially as a guy, Ric Flair actually has a very interesting story, is that he was adopted by a doctor and his wife who couldn't have children. And he might have actually been a black market baby. There was in the South, especially because people wanted white babies. So they would go to the rural South and they would find like unwed mothers, teen mothers, mainly single women, who were giving birth to babies, and then they would make them sign a bunch of documents under coercion or under threats or misinformation to basically have them sign away their rights to their own babies. And then they would send those babies to orphanages. And Ric Flair is one of those babies.
Yeah, that's fascinating about Ric Flair and his parentage. I did not know. I think maybe I read somewhere about his being a orphan or an unwanted child or what have you, that he was adopted. I guess he was raised okay. Maybe hopefully his parents treat him with kindness and love. I don't know. But like you said, he's probably not the greatest father now. I know he has suffered from alcohol problems, and I kind of also don't want him to go back in the ring. He's 70-something. At some point, you just got to say, enough, Rick. Let it go. Like, you're 70-odd years old. I don't think you should be wrestling anymore. And I did see bits and pieces of that retirement fight, and it was hard to watch, actually. He still cut his forehead, and it was, ugh. Anyways, it's funny about Ric Flair. Growing up as a wrestling fan as a kid, of course, I was a big Hulk Hogan fan. And I remember Ric Flair back in the day being like as I saw it, because not understanding WCW at the time or those other circuits, that Ric Flair was the poor man's version of Hogan. And I remember people like saying, no, Ric Flair is better than Hogan. But as I've gotten older, of course, and recognize wrestling for what it is and the showmanship that it is, that Ric Flair is an incredible showman, legend in the ring. And I get the arguments saying that he is quote unquote better than Hogan. I'm a Hogan mark, as they say, because I was raised on Hogan. That was my childhood wrestling hero. As an adult and looking back at the profession, I totally get Ric Flair and understand who he is, and got to see him a little bit in WCW when I was watching Monday Night and WCW Monday Night Wars, the Wrestling Wars on Monday night. But anyways, great stuff, great information on Ric Flair. How often did Hogan and Flair fight, though, in WWE? Did they ever have any big fights?
They only wrestled in WWF on a series of house shows in around 1992. Like, the whole buildup initially was going to be Flair versus Hogan at WrestleMania 8, but they never ran a program because they did a few test matches between them, and it never went well, because usually said, and a lot of it is that people were cheering the wrong guy. Without going too much into the ending of is that I said it was WWF in 1992. If they were doing a Flair Hogan program and they didn't like who was becoming more popular, it was the same reason why Jake the Snake never feuded with Hulk Hogan. They only really wrestled in WCW. The 90s, they never wrestled until they were both in WCW. They didn't face off until 1994 when Hogan beat Flair for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. It was the first televised program they had. They did a series of house shows, and they wanted Hogan to be the favorite, and Flair was the favorite. And the crowd wasn't getting into it. Yeah. They dropped that program, and they didn't wrestle until the 90s. And then Flair went back to WCW about 93, 94, and actually had a late career renaissance up until about Hogan's return. And then in the late 90s, with the way WCW was being mismanaged into the ground, he really got buried in the shuffle. Then he went to WWE in 2002, formed Evolution in 2004 with Triple H, Randy Orton, and Dave Bautista, like basically making Dave Bautista into another one of the biggest stars in Hollywood. Flair has had a long storied career, and he is easily probably one of the best to have ever done it. I said he wasn't one of my favorites growing up, but as I go back and watch it, I appreciate what he did, especially if you want to go back and watch some amazing wrestling. The 3 matches he had with Ricky Steamboat in 1989 are to this day some of the best matches. Ricky Steamboat isn't on this list because it's the greatest wrestlers of the 90s. Steamboat is one of the key guys of the 80s.
Yeah, you weren't on the episode where I covered the 80s wrestlers, and Steamboat was amazing. In fact, I don't even know if we put Steamboat on that list of the 80s wrestlers. Oops, sorry, Steamboat. Amazing wrestler. His fights with Randy Savage were one of a kind. All right, so my next one is Stone Cold Steve Austin. No one could have predicted that WCW mid-card heel stunning Steve Austin would close out the decade as the most popular star in wrestling. All it took was an attitude change in ECW and some opportunities to shine in WWE, and Austin became the icon of the Attitude Era. Now, since then, it feels like every few years there's an attempt to recreate the magic of Austin via a turn as an anti-hero who flouts traditional heel/face dynamics or an evil authority storyline that doesn't work. Then there's his finisher, the Stunner, which still remains a popular move for countless wrestlers. So Steve Austin was more than the face of the WWE. He was literally the electroshock the company needed. He was the leader of the mythic Attitude Era, and he contributed like no other to help Vince McMahon to save the company from bankruptcy and to eventually win the Monday Night Wars. Stone Cold was to the 90s what Hogan was to the 80s, I think it's fair to say. He was the perfect leader, and he was like a god for the fans. Remember the beer drinking, the Texas rattlesnake, also known as the toughest SOB. So in WWE history, he managed to become an icon in only 5 years. Among other accomplishments in the 90s, he won the WWF Championship 4 times, the Royal Rumble on 2 occasions, and he became the 1996 King of the Ring. When the Texas rattlesnake first entered the squared circle, no one would have ever fathomed that the wrestler would turn out into one of the greatest wrestlers of all time. Although Austin showed glimpses of hope during his early days, he was still a shadow of the wrestler he would later turn out to be. During his period, Austin was a pretty average wrestler with nearly zero technical skills and went by the ring name Steve Williams. Under the guidance of Dutch Mantell, Austin changed his ring name to Steve Austin, as the same name Steve Williams was not available. So then again, after a brief appearance as a pro wrestler, Austin returned to Texas to receive a crash course in professional wrestling, and in his second appearance for ECW, Austin would take part in a teacher versus student storyline with Adams, one of the biggest stars from Texas. So what began as a simple storyline ultimately turned into one of the biggest and best feuds of all time. Adams played a crucial role in hiding Steve Austin's weaknesses as the wrestler continued to learn the ropes of pro wrestling. Then a few years down the line, Austin had grown into one of the most promising young prospects in WCW. Austin would later join the Dangerous Stable Alliance headed by Paul Heyman before feuding with the likes of Ricky Steamboat. Nonetheless, a string of injuries would see a young Austin go down the pecking order. Ultimately, however, Austin got involved in a disagreement with WCW chair Eric Bischoff, which led to his dismissal from the company. Then, after a brief stint in ECW, Austin would ultimately sign with the WWE, and the rest was history. So that's a little bit of background of his early days, and no man quite like him. Austin 316. What are your thoughts on Stone Cold Steve Austin?
He was an absolute 90s anti-hero, to an archetype almost. They even said is that at his peak, like in 1998, 99, Stone Cold Steve Austin was selling more merchandise than Hulk Hogan ever did. Steve Austin is actually probably at his peak, he's the most popular professional wrestler of all time. If you just want to do like on pure metrics, he's a great one. I think what's interesting about Steve Austin for me is that there's always this kind of argument over the concept of a professional wrestler. And the term that Vincent McMahon loved so much was sports entertainer, right? He didn't like to he inherited the company from his father, but he never liked the term wrestling. He was really one that tried to coin the term sports entertainment. So there's always this argument over, is this wrestler the difference between a wrestler and a sports entertainer? And while Steve Austin very much loves the idea of professional wrestling, and he has a brilliant mind for it, if you ever listen to his podcast and things like that, and him talk about professional wrestling, he fundamentally understands how the industry works to this day. And he says a lot of things that I believe are true. I think he has a brilliant mind for it. But it's very funny is that he doesn't like to be seen as a sports entertainer. But when you really think about, like I said earlier, about what you remember most about Stone Cold Steve Austin, it's not his matches for the most part. It's him. It's the beer truck. It's the Zamboni. It's the pointing a gun at his boss's head. It's all the backstage vignettes. Most of his for years, especially because there was like a good year period where he actually couldn't wrestle, but they had to come show up every week to hit a bunch of guys in the face with a chair, give a bunch of Stone Cold stunners, and run off. I think he's got 5 or 6 reigns as a WWE champion, but his combined title history is like 104 days. He was the working man anti-hero, right? So you can actually put the title on him. He was a guy that perpetually had to chase it. So every time he got it, there had to be a shenanigans to get it off of him. He wouldn't be entertaining as a fighting defending champion. He's the working man getting screwed over by his boss. Really, he benefited the most of one of the most significant events in wrestling history because it created the Vince McMahon character. We'll talk about that event later because it ties into wrestlers later on the list. But he was a perfect foil for the Mr. McMahon character. And near the end of his in-ring career, but I think that a lot of it was just also... The Rock famously gave a took his ball and went home promo about Steve Austin when he up and quit. But I think a lot of that was also his personal life was unraveling. He was in a Obviously, like the toils of what he was doing was working on him. Basically, that move, the Stone Cold Stunner, is as fun as it is to watch. You're landing on your tailbone 20 times a day. The guy's in pain. And he suffered that spinal cord injury in SummerSlam 97. Basically, for 5 years, this guy was ravaging his spinal cord. Eventually, that's going to have an adverse effect on your mental health. I think that near the end, he was just getting burnt out. He was probably just overexerted. And near the end, but it said it was just near the end. And other than that, he has been a consummate professional. And to this day, he's regarded as he's one of those people that is vindicated throughout history by his opinions. Like, he doesn't seem to be wrong very often. I would say overall, he is one of the more loved voices in the professional wrestling industry.
Very well said, brother. Very well said. Yeah, I love Austin. I love him when I watch wrestling. I think he's a great voice for just like you said, the industry. Great voice, ambassador for the sport, for the entertainment. And yeah, you never hear any fans or otherwise saying anything bad about Stone Cold Steve Austin. He's great. Well said. Okay, you've got the next one.
Yeah, the Big Red Machine, Kane. Well, so Glenn Jacobs was like another just kind of journeyman wrestler who had the benefit of being very tall. He is billed at 7 feet tall. What you find out with wrestlers is that they're never their actual height.
Yeah, you hear about the Big Show. What was he, like the Giant? Of course, there's Andre the Giant, but the Big Show was like the English-speaking type giant. What do they bill him at? Like 7'2" or 7'3"? Is he someone that was told that he was taller than he really was?
So the Big Show is a funny one to talk about because like when they had WrestleMania in Orlando a few years ago, and then like they had an Andre the Giant Memorial Battle Royal, and Shaq was like a guest star because of his connection to the Orlando Magic. And Shaq is a legitimate 7 feet 2 inches tall. If you watch this giant man walk to this ring, and then he basically grabs the top, like he's standing upright, grabs the top ropes, puts his foot on the ring apron, steps up, and then steps over the ropes. That alone has actually haunted me for years because, one, it shows a lot of what makes wrestlers look the way they are. Is like you learn about it, like Walt Disney Imagineering was like really big in it. Like I actually have a weird love of Disney parks and how they're engineered, and they do a lot of forced perspective where they make things seem bigger than they really are. But once you have Shaq in a wrestling ring, the entire illusion is blown because like here you have an actual person is the size they're saying, and he's like up to the Big Show, and he's like a full half a head taller than the Big Show. I probably think about Shaq in his relation to the world more than like a normal person should because I'm like, that guy is so damn big. It's amazing. But Kane's up like 6. So if you're like 6'7" to 6'9", they're going to say you're 7 feet tall. And Kane was this huge guy, was a consummate professional. He had a series of, quite frankly, dog shit gimmicks for years, right? It was Isaac Yankem DDS. He was the fake Diesel in 1997. He had a bunch of terrible gimmicks until 1997 when the WWE was hinting that Paul Bearer, who Undertaker recently split as his manager, was referring to Kane. He said that Kane is still alive. Kane is returning. And there was actually even an added mystique because and you can see it, I think, on an episode of WWF Superstars from like 1990, before Survivor Series. They actually call The Undertaker Kane the Undertaker, was actually his initial name. He was trying to honor his dead brother. He was told that Kane was returning. And then Undertaker, who at this point had nearly 7 years as like one of the WWF's aces, right? He was like a top guy from like the moment he started about. The Undertaker was like a huge guy, and then he had this guy who was bigger than him, scarier than him. Undertaker has supernatural like lightning and ghost powers, and this guy can control freaking fire. So they have this years-long feud. The two brothers like are fighting each other, and it's easily Kane's most important storyline in his wrestling career as the anti-Undertaker. His on-again, off-again relationship with his demon cowboy half-brother. He's one of the great guys. He had a couple short world title reigns. He's not really regarded as a champion, but he had such a long storied career, and he remained super loyal to the WWF, WWE, took on a series of roles, helped build talent, right? He's been there. And then I don't agree with his politics personally, but it is pretty admirable that he's now. Yeah, he's the mayor of Knox, because like Tennessee is. I don't know how you're a mayor of a county, but he's a mayor of a county. I don't know how they do things over there in the more rural East Coast, but he's the mayor of Knox County, Tennessee. For better or for worse, I think that's what's really intriguing about him, is that he shows that there is a life outside of professional wrestling. There's going to be a few people on this list that did it way better than he did, but I don't think he's benefiting his community. But I think that he's at least trying to benefit his community. This is also a guy who spent 20 years getting hit in the face with steel chairs. So,
yeah, Kane was an interesting character. I almost sometimes think he was like the poor man's version, the Wish.com version of The Undertaker. And when he got demasked, I have to say he's not a very handsome guy. I guess that's probably why he wears the mask. But a great personality, a great foil and storyline with The Undertaker. I agree with your incredible, I guess your expose or essay, I should say, of Kane with his time with Undertaker. But I know Kane had different gimmicks. Wasn't he Krampus or something like that?
No, yeah, that's what I was thinking. He had a Krampus kind of gimmick. He had a lot of really bad ones.
Yeah, the Krampus thing was not a good look. I looked at some of those old photos there of him and of Kane when he was unmasked. And let's be honest, he's no handsome dude like Mr. Shawn Michaels.
Oh, yeah. Shawn Michaels benefits from being in an area, really at a time where he was a good-looking guy, but he looked better based on the people around him, because we all ignore HBK's lazy eye.
All right, so I've got the next one. Terry Gene Bollea, better known as Hulk Hogan, was born on August 11th, 1953 in Augusta, Georgia. Hogan's wrestling career began in 1977, but it was his signing with the World Wrestling Federation, now the WWE, in 1983 that propelled him to global stardom. Hogan's larger-than-life persona as a heroic, all-American figure captivated audiences during the 80s professional wrestling boom. He headlined a record-breaking 8 editions of WrestleMania, solidifying his status as one of the most popular wrestlers of all time. Hogan's charisma and in-ring prowess made him a household name, and his matches became must-see events for fans around the world. I was definitely a Hogan mark, as they say, when I was a kid. I used to watch Saturday Night's Main Event all the time. I was there when Hogan got betrayed by Andre. Hogan was everything to me as a kid back in the day. I was the perfect age. Born in 75, was 8 years old in 83, so I was just that perfect age for the Hogan era. So not only did Hogan dominate the wrestling scene, but he also made waves outside the ring. For example, in 93, he ventured into film and television, expanding his reach and popularity. However, his love for wrestling brought him back to the ring when he signed with rival promotion WCW in 94. During his time in WCW, of course, Hogan reinvented himself as Hollywood Hulk Hogan, adopting a villainous persona and leading the infamous New World Order stable. This move, of course, sparked another wrestling boom known as the Monday Night Wars, with Hogan at the forefront. Throughout his career, Hogan achieved numerous accolades. He won the WWF Championship 5 times, the WCW World Heavyweight Championship 6 times, holding the record for the longest reign in the latter promotion. He was also the first wrestler to win consecutive Royal Rumble matches in 90 and 91. Hogan's impact extended beyond his in-ring achievements. His larger-than-life personality and crossover appeal helped elevate professional wrestling's popularity to unprecedented heights. He became a cultural phenomenon and an inspiration to aspiring wrestlers worldwide. As with any great figure, Hogan's legacy faced challenges and controversies. One notable incident involved his involvement in a lawsuit against Gawker Media, financed by billionaire Peter Thiel. Hogan sought $100 million in damages for the release of a sex tape featuring him. This case drew attention to the intersection of privacy, freedom of the press, and the power of big money. Today, Hogan has retired from professional wrestling, but his impact continues to be felt. He remains one of the most recognizable and beloved figures in the history of the sport. So Hogan has had quite a legendary career. What are your thoughts on Hogan there?
So Hulk Hogan is one of the most important, obviously, like the most important thing that, of course, is Hulk Hogan as Thunderlips, the Ultimate Male in Rocky 3 was a huge, and funny thing is that he was in, I think at the time it might have still been the WWWF. Yeah, Vince McMahon Sr., he was in the WWWF, and then he was offered the part of Thunderlips. He said, I'm going to take the part of Thunderlips. And McMahon said no. He was a promoter. We forget that wrestling was it is also part of like our America's carny past. The more unsavory elements can really be like taken to like the carnyism at its core. And Vince McMahon Sr., Jr. was very much still a carny, but Sr. was very still like in the carny mindset, right? He wasn't too far removed from the carny scene. So he didn't really want anybody who might expose the business as a work, like what they called wrestling. That he didn't want anybody who might compromise the kayfabe. So he was very worried about what having a wrestler on the show, playing a wrestler. It doesn't help that like it is flat out shown to be like a work in the exhibition match between Rocky and Thunder Lips is very much staged. They even like hint at it. Vince McMahon Sr. did not want him on this one, so he did that. Then he jumped ship to AWA, and then Vince Jr. bought the company, bought his dad out, and then brought Hulk Hogan back, put the world title on, and had him beat the Iron Sheik in Madison Square Garden. And the rest, they say, is history.
That's an awesome recap of the early Hogan. What's your thoughts on his time with WCW, like after his WWE days? What's your insight on that I spoke to?
From about 92 to 96, Hulk Hogan's stock was dropping like really hard, right? People were sick of that take your vitamins, say your prayers, drink your milk. He was very much losing that popularity. He tried to transition to Hollywood with Thunder in Paradise. That didn't go over very well. And then Eric Bischoff recently was promoted as an executive for WCW and really was trying to... Ted Turner was actually genuinely trying to compete with Vince McMahon, who was at the time the more established property. And Bischoff said, the only way you're going to beat him is to take some of his best. They recruited Hogan in 94. They made him world champion almost immediately, having him beat Ric Flair. But he wasn't popular. He just was not popular in WCW. And then 1996, same thing. Razor Ramon and Diesel are two of the hottest guys in WWF. Kevin Nash, Diesel had a year-long run with the title. They both get poached to go to WCW, who really starts this whole is this real or is this not angle by implying that these guys are from the World Wrestling Federation trying to bring down WCW. And then it all culminates with Hulk Hogan turning heel for the first time since 1982. Yeah, he turned heel, and then Eric Bischoff eventually later joined, which I think actually was what started ruining the story, the NWO angle. But yeah, when he turned, that really had ripples. There's like a guy who loses his mind and like tries to beat up, like he charges ring and tries to beat up Hulk Hogan. Because there were still, at the time, they were still committing to the kayfabe. And people like at this point didn't completely just, now everybody knows, but there were still some believers like in the crowd at the time. Like, that really shattered the paradigm, but it helped create the Monday Night War. It helped elevate professional wrestling to where it is today in that bigger heyday it had in the 90s.
Yeah, I'll admit I stopped watching wrestling about the same time that he got sold to WCW. Then I went back and watched it again. I think I stopped watching wrestling in 1990. So I missed Hogan's exit from the WWF, and I wasn't there when he was. I don't think I was watching the Monday Night Wars when he first turned Hollywood Hogan. I've seen the clips on YouTube since, but I did watch The Rock and Steve Austin. I mentioned this already, maybe that I started rewatching wrestling, or watching it again, I should say, during the Monday Night Wars and the Attitude Era. So Hogan was a part of that. I actually quite enjoyed Nitro. I think I had a soft spot for Nitro because they did have all the old wrestlers that you're talking about, the people they pawned off, like Macho Man and Jake the Snake or Hogan. And so, anyways, yeah, great stuff. So I think you got the next one there, buddy.
Triple H, Hunter Hearst Helmsley, Paul Levesque of New Hampshire. Paul Levesque started in, I think, 93, 94. He was trained by Killer Kowalski, and then he told Killer Kowalski, I don't want some stupid-ass name like the Neck Breaker or the Bruiser or something like that. And then Kowalski had his name laid out, and it was the Terrorizer. And he said, well, you're not going to be the Terrorizer, then you're going to be terrorizing. That didn't go over well, so he then tried to do a foppish French. He became Jean-Paul Levesque. And then WCW was cutting some of the mid-card talent that wasn't going anywhere, like Stone Cold Steve Austin and Triple H and a couple other guys. And WWF was in a kind of a financial pinch. So they started picking up these mid-level guys on the cheap to build them up to be bigger stars in the future. And one of them was Paul Levesque, who became the Connecticut dandy boy Hunter Hearst Helmsley. And backstage, he was hanging out with Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, Sean Waltman, and a gentleman later on the list who became the famous The Click. And then in 1996, right before, they had one match at Madison Square Garden where Shawn Michaels and Diesel versus Triple H, or Hunter Hearst Helmsley and Razor Ramon. Or at the end of the match, this wasn't a televised match, but it was going to be the last match for Kevin Nash and Scott Hall in WWF. At the end of the match, the four of them, and these were heels and baby faces, were hugged it out in the ring. They said goodbye, and a fan was filming it from the stands. And it became a huge problem because this was still breaking the kayfabe. And two guys were leaving. One guy was a top star. Somebody had to be punished for this offense. And then Triple H, who was slated to be winning the King of the Ring tournament in 1996, was pushed down to the bottom of the card. And Stone Cold Steve Austin was then penciled in to win the King of the Ring tournament, where he then issued the famous Austin 316 promo. So basically, by Triple H being punished, by him hugging his friends in the ring, was like a butterfly effect that led to the Attitude Era. He was a mainstay in the stable DX, D-Generation X, with his former partner, Joni Laurer China, that went to have Sean Waltman, Brian Armstrong, known as Road Dogg Jesse James, and Monty Sopp, who's known as the Badass Billy Gunn. They had one of the most legendary stables in all of professional wrestling in D-Generation X. Triple H, to me, is within the professional wrestling industry itself. He is the biggest success story because he went from a wrestler to now he is the chief creative officer of the biggest wrestling company in the world. And he actually has shown to have a really brilliant mind for the wrestling industry, because I think that he's one of the first people. I think that, like where I was talking about the carnies, is that Triple H is somebody who is completely divorced from the carny part of professional wrestling. He has none of that carnyism in it. He understands it as an entertainment medium because he remembers watching it on TV, growing up watching it on TV, being on TV. So he has a more fundamental understanding, and that's why wrestling, like, this is a guy who genuinely loves wrestling, committed his life to it, paying off in dividends. How we got there, there's some shady stuff here and there. He burned a few bridges. But overall, I think that he's a great wrestler. He's a 14-time world champion. He's got a slew of lower titles on there. But now his NXT era was considered one of the greatest developmentals of the slew of world champions that have come out of his guidance. And now having him running TV, it's a few months ago, for the first time in history, there are two premier wrestling organizations in the world right now, or in the United States, AEW and WWE. And for the first time ever, there is not a man named McMahon in charge of one of them. And we are now actually in one of the most exciting times to be watching professional wrestling, because the potential of how great it can be, and the potential of the talent forged by basically the mind of Triple H in a lot of ways. I'm really excited, and he has a lot to do with where it is. So I think that he deserves his flowers in a lot of ways. He developed a history as a person who did a lot of backstage politicking and quote unquote, buried a lot of talent. I think he's one of those guys that's vindicated in history, because all the people that have complained about him have all turned out to be jackasses. If you watch CM Punk's Gripe Bomb, if any of your fans want to check out the backstage drama behind what's going on in All Elite Wrestling, centered around CM Punk, who famously is one of the people who started a smear campaign on Triple H. It turns out you were the punk, pardon the pun, but you were the guy causing the problems here. Good, bad, or indifferent, I think that, again, his efforts have made wrestling really spectacular. So I want to give my propers. I'll just spoil alert, Triple H is definitely not going to be on my worst list.
All right, Tony, you get the one time where you get to say something's not your worst pick, and that is Triple H for you. Totally understand. I agree with you. Triple H for me was a bit of a slow burn, I admit, when I started watching the Attitude Era. I think at first, because I didn't really know who he was, I didn't really see his build. I kind of came in when he was already part of DX, I believe. He was doing the suck this and all that stuff. Got 2 words for you. I wasn't a big fan of his cohorts, but I think when he went away from DX, it became just more of his own beast of a man of Triple H. I think I started to respect him more, and I think everything you said was perfectly said regarding his business sense of the industry, and of course he gets to bed Stephanie, so good for him. Yeah, all in all, he's not my worst pick either. I don't think so, but we'll find out at the end of the episode. Okay, I've got the next one. You ready for this one? Goldberg. So he was born December 27th, 1966 in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He was born William Scott Goldberg, so actually one of the few wrestlers who kept his birth name, you could say Bill Goldberg. Of course, he's made that name for himself as one of the most intense wrestlers of all time. Goldberg's journey to wrestling superstardom didn't start in the ring, but on the football field. After a successful career as a football player, including a stint with the Atlanta Falcons, Goldberg transitioned to professional wrestling in 1997. He began his training at WCW Power Plant and quickly caught the attention of fans and fellow wrestlers alike. With his immense strength and explosive energy, Goldberg captured the hearts of fans during the late 90s and early 2000s, which is often referred to as the professional wrestling boom. He gained fame in WCW with an incredible undefeated streak in singles competition, amassing over 170 victories without a single loss. This remarkable achievement made him one of WCW's most dominant and popular stars. Goldberg's signature move, the spear, became his trademark. With lightning-fast speed and power, he would launch himself at his opponents, leaving them lying in the ring. Sort of basically like a football move. His execution of the spear was second to none, earning him the reputation of being the best in the business. I guess it depends on who you ask. So during his time in WCW, Goldberg achieved numerous accolades. He became a 1-time WCW World Heavyweight Champion, 2-time WCW United States Heavyweight Champion, and even held the WCW World Tag Team Championship with none other than Bret Hart. Alongside Hart, he cemented his place in wrestling history as the 5th WCW Triple Crown winner. After WCW's closure in 2001, Goldberg took a break from wrestling. However, his passion for the sport brought him back to the ring. He wrestled for All Japan Pro Wrestling from 2002 to 2003 and later joined the WWE in 2003. In the WWE, Goldberg became a 1-time World Heavyweight Champion, further solidifying his status as a top-tier competitor. In 2016, after a hiatus of 12 years, Goldberg made a triumphant return to the WWE again. He captured the WWE Universal Championship not once but twice. His comeback was met with thunderous applause from fans who were thrilled to see their beloved Goldberg back in action. Beyond wrestling, Goldberg has also ventured into acting, making appearances in movies and TV shows. His larger-than-life persona and commanding presence translated well to the screen, allowing him to entertain audiences in a different capacity. With his remarkable career, Goldberg has become an iconic figure in the world of professional wrestling. His intensity, athleticism, and undeniable charisma have left an indelible mark on the industry. Whether he's spearing opponents or captivating audiences with his on-screen performances, Bill Goldberg will always be remembered as a true wrestling legend. So that wraps up my little write-up on the life and career of the one and only Bill Goldberg. Thanks for listening, Tony, and everyone else. What's your thoughts on old Bill there, Tony? And specifically, what do you think of his entrance that he always did? His big entrance in the ring, I think, was always the funnest thing that he did.
He had a wicked sick entrance, especially because they would have the police escort, and the implication was that the police aren't there to protect him, but to protect us from him. He's not my worst, but he's actually a guy that, for as interesting he is, my problem with him is that he's totally an executive creation, right? He wasn't organic in any way, shape, or form. Even his 173 match win streak, they would add numbers. His win streak is fake. I think that his matches were, because he had a great look. He obviously had 2 of the best moves in wrestling, which is the jackhammer, which is one of the coolest looking moves ever, and then the spear, which is largely the most protected finisher in all of professional wrestling. If anybody who uses the spear wins a lot. It's a visually stunning, it looks really cool on TV. It looks like a nice football sack, right? It looks like a wicked sick football tackle. So he just was already packed with that. A lot of that also is that Eric Bischoff has transparently admitted that he literally got a bald guy in black trunks to be on TV doing something interesting because he knew that uninitiated fans or potential fans would be like, "I'm hearing the stuff about this dude. They just say he's like this bald guy in trunks. Oh, okay, here's a bald guy in trunks in a wrestling ring, and the crowd's really into it. I guess this must be the guy they're talking about." Goldberg also has a history of being a very dangerous person to work with. That's why his match is so short, is that he most famously ended somebody who's later on the list. Basically, he led to that guy's career ending in a roundabout way. He's actually not a very good wrestler. He's just a very interesting look. He's got a cool entrance. He's very much a sports entertainer. He is a package, but when like you actually see him in the ring, much like the Ultimate Warrior in the 80s, he was actually a very weak in-ring performer who was turfed into being like a people's champion.
Very well said, as always, Tony. You are the wrestling expert, of course, and your insights are just incredible. And everything you said regarding Goldberg being manufactured, I guess I never thought of it that way, but yeah, I can see that. But even the manufactured wrestler is still something that was fun to watch. I guess I didn't mind him. I liked him when I watched him back in the Attitude Era or the Monday Night Wars. I enjoyed it. I knew that he wasn't the wrestler that other wrestlers were, but still a fun piece of entertainment. Okay, moving on. You've got speaking of fan favorites and somebody who doesn't look anything like Goldberg, you've got the next one.
This guy is my personal favorite wrestler and one of my favorite human beings, and that is Mick Foley. Wrestled as Mankind, Dude Love, Cactus Jack throughout his career. The hardcore legend. I think he's a 3-time WWF champion. And what I always love about Mick Foley is that Mick Foley, he even said, "I don't want to be a wrestler. I don't want to go out and be champion," because like he looked at himself one day and he's, "I think I can be a good working wrestler, right? I can be a very good mid-card guy. I can be a very good ring hand. I'm not the kind of guy who's going to change all over this and that." But then he did. And I think that's so cool as a person. Right? He's a guy who never even had believed in himself, but because he was such an endearing man of the people that he just organically got over and sold himself. And he's legit, like he said, like whereas Goldberg is very much and to the point where you see like Goldberg is like a Greek god, right? He's 6'4", 250 pounds, got like an 8-pack abs, bulging pecs. He's got like that perfect level of chest hair where it looks like a tough man, right? Like here, like this guy you couldn't make something better in a freaking lab. And then you got dumpy, chubby Mick Foley, and people just got over it. And also, Mick Foley to this day, you can't talk about him without talking about the 1998 King of the Ring Hell in a Cell match against The Undertaker, where he was thrown off the top of the freaking cage onto a table, and then chokeslammed. And then went to go have a match after being thrown off the cage, got back up on top, got choked, and that one was on accident. He wasn't supposed to go through the ring. Now you can see like there's hinges on him and things like that. Dude lost a freaking tooth in that match, and that spot was so dangerous and outlandish that to this day it has not actually been replicated. It'll never happen again. Absolutely. And even when people fall off cells and stuff like now, they'll fall like onto an airbag, or there's little tricks here and there. But he was thrown off that cage right onto a table. To this day, I'm so glad I hadn't seen anything like it, because like that, like I was 14. I'm like, this is like mind blowing. So he just got over by his willingness to like please the crowd and please the people. He's a perfect example. I always say is that people like to bemoan wrestling as if it's plebeian or pedestrian. But I always say that Shakespeare wrote for the groundlings, right? He actually didn't write for the people in the stands. He wrote for the peasants in the crowd. Mick Foley was a man of the people, and he did something incredible. It was very dangerous. And like I said, I think about the one that Kevin Sullivan, he said he saw it and he told the other guys, like, pack it in. Nobody's ever doing anything like that again. Like he crossed a threshold in a way that no one ever else will, which is great because it made us all focus more on like in-ring prowess and skills as a wrestler, which Mick Foley was very good at. I'm not saying to say that he didn't have to, he just found his niche. But then outside of wrestling, he's also a very great guy, right? He's a novelist. Have a Nice Day, his autobiography, he wrote about winning the WWF championship. Great book. He's a great writer. And then around Christmas time, he's freaking Santa Claus. He dyes his beard white and he's Santa Claus. He is probably just genuinely a good all-around human being. And the one sad thing about it is that he's so wholesome and so humble. And I've met a lot because when I used to work at convention center, and as a security guard, we have a lot of like famous people go in and out. Legitimately, the only human being I've ever gotten starstruck in their presence was Mick Foley. And he's the guy I wanted to just shake his hand and say thank you. But I saw him and I froze in my tracks. And it's ironic because he's probably the most approachable human being in face of the earth. And so he's a guy you've never heard an ill word said about him. He's universally loved. He's a saint, in my opinion. I think that's when I was trying to like list like pros, like bad things about any wrestler. I looked at Mick Foley. I'm like, he's a little corny. That's what makes me love him even more. I love the man. I said, is that Mick Foley is such a decent human being. The fact that he is that he portrays Santa Claus, in my mind, that makes Santa Claus real. Because if anybody is Santa Claus, it is Mick Foley. And I like to also think about the idea that Santa Claus is also like a hardcore wrestling legend. The most awesome thing in the world. I love Mick Foley. I will fight people who disparage that man.
All right, Tony, I've got the next one. You might have heard of this guy, The Rock, the man who ushered WWE into the new millennium, had a less than stellar rise to fame during the 1990s. His humble debut as Rocky Maivia in 1996 didn't hint at the legendary status he would achieve by the time he concluded his wrestling journey in 2005. I can't believe it's already been 18 years since he officially retired from the wrestling. Although he didn't achieve the honor of winning the King of the Ring tournament or the Royal Rumble, he remarkably secured his first championship title just 3 months after his debut. Despite this achievement, he initially struggled to connect with the audience, necessitating a significant transformation. This pivotal change occurred in May of '97 when he morphed into The Rock and aligned himself with the Nation of Domination faction. However, it was in 1998 that he truly became into his own, revealing previously hidden microphone skills. He captivated crowds like never before. He departed from the Nation and joined the Corporation, a move that further elevated his presence. In November 1998, he clinched his inaugural WWF Championship, followed by 2 more title reigns in '99. With the close of the decade, a new icon emerged, etching his legacy into the annals of history. In terms of in-ring prowess, The Rock exhibited commendable wrestling abilities, consistently delivering standout performances. However, his allure lay not primarily in his matches, but in his character, renowned for his charisma. The Rock stands amongst the most charismatic wrestlers in history. His self-assured, quick-witted persona and unparalleled promo skills remain unmatched to this day, making him the paragon of a WWE superstar. As one of the greatest wrestlers in history, The Rock's gift of gab and anti-hero strategies ensured his position as a truly unforgettable figure within the squared circle. His mastery of verbal jousting endeared him to fans, establishing him as the people's beloved provocateur. By the culmination of his illustrious wrestling career, The Rock's accomplishments were numerous. Notably, he secured the World Championship title a remarkable 10 times, complemented by 5 Tag Team Championship wins and 2 Intercontinental Championship victories. Needless to say, The Rock was amazing, and I agree that his mic skills were top-notch. And the way he got the crowd going with the smell what The Rock is cooking and the way he told people to shut up and all that kind of stuff, it was just incredible. But the crowd didn't like him at first when he joined wrestling. Isn't that true?
They hated him when he first started as the Blue Chipper. He was another guy who went over the wet fart. Like, they hated him because he was such a contrivance, right? He was like another one that was like felt manufactured. But Vince McMahon like doubled down and said there's something in him, and he just didn't figure it out yet. But once he got that, he's now the biggest movie star in the world. If he were to run for president of the United States, he'd probably win with 64% of the vote.
Yeah, that's not insane to think about. And of course, Arnold Schwarzenegger ran for governor of California, won that. Seeing The Rock run for president and even winning is, look, worse things can happen. Worse things could happen.
We like to pretend that like our system of governance is like, we like to believe in the myth of it, but it is such an organizational bureaucracy at this point that like our president is really just more like a monarch. It's really just more of a ceremonial role, like the queen or the king. It's not really like It's just more of that. Like there are appointments in this, but it's such a machine that you have a say in like the general direction of the machine, like whether or not it will march into the ditch or go a little this way or it'll go a little that way. But I think that he's popular enough that he could get a huge amount of the vote without it. And I don't even think he needs a platform. I think that he's just so enjoyable that people would just be like, he give a speech where he gives like one of those platitude speeches where he says nothing, and people would just be like, yeah, I have a lot of belief in that guy.
The Rock right now is in the public eye. He has that show, what's it called again? Like The Young Rock or something like that, Little Rock or something, which is about his life. It's actually about his life and career, and I didn't realize it was that autobiographical. What are your thoughts on that show?
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, I will have to put that. So they got that show right, Young Rock, where the one, by the way, that starts with him in the White House winning a presidential election. That the first season, the idea is that he's narrating, like he's doing the Wonder Years thing, but he's narrating from the White House, from the Oval Office. And then in one episode, it shows a bunch of Samoan wrestlers of the Anawai family. That's what they say. I was trying to remember because I've only ever read it. And then now that Vince McMahon is gone, like a guy who's really winning on this is Michael Cole. Can actually show that he's actually a really great announcer without being yelled at in his headphones nonstop. And so Cole now gives off like wrestling history. And he talked about how Roman Reigns and the Usos and now their brother, who's now wrestling in WWE, how they're all part of the Anawai family, which is this very famous Samoan wrestling dynasty. And The Rock is roundabout a member of that family because his step-grandfather, the High Chief Peter Maivia, was blood brothers of the patriarch of the Anawai family. So they see him as one of their own. They have this scene in Young Rock where he's a bunch of the Anawai are over at their house watching wrestling, and the little cousin Joe is like, Dwayne, or Dewey, they call him Dewey. He's like, Dewey, acknowledge me. And it's little Roman Reigns, Joe Leati Anawai. And Joe says to his cousin, he's like, do you ever think we'll have a wrestling match? And he's, Joe, something that big can only be contained at WrestleMania. Yeah, it's hinting at it. But like, that's synergy, baby. That's just where we are, where everything is. And when anything can be owned by 3 corporations, it's very easy for them all to just kind of.
That's really cool. I think I got to watch the show. I didn't realize it was that much of a kind of art and life and art. How true is the show to real life?
They have him, I think now in the show, it's about him in the WWF, his early days in WWF.
All right, cool. What network is it on? So I see if I can catch that show.
I think it's on NBC, which is basically the NBC Comcast, which is where the USA Network is. There's a lot of corporate partnerships there. In the United States, we don't have the WWE Network anymore. To access the WWE Network, you have to subscribe to Peacock, which is the NBC streaming service.
I gotta say, it's really hard to deny the likability of The Rock. People that aren't even wrestling fans like The Rock. His place in popular culture and just real life is huge now. He influences a lot of people. It's just fun to think about his early days to now. Even
when people are booing him, you do look at this guy, and he is this tall. He had movie star good looks. He had a $1 million smile, right? He's just naturally likable and charismatic. Like the fact, if he wanted to be president, he could, because he just has. If there was one human being who has the it factor in any way, shape, or form, it's Dwayne The Rock Johnson.
All right, brother. Great stuff. Great insight as always, Tony. But you've got the next one. Who is next?
I got easily one of the greatest in-ring technicians of all time, one of the greatest wrestlers ever, the Heartbreak Kid, Shawn Michaels. Shawn Michaels is one of the most revolutionary wrestlers to ever lace a pair of boots. Started off in Texas, then moved his way, I believe, to the AWA, where he and Marty Jannetty became the Rockers, or the Midnight Rockers. There was a bunch of guys. They're all trying to basically be the Midnight Express. They went to WWF, and then famously, as Bobby Heenan put it, cowardly tried to jump through the window to dodge Shawn Michaels' kicks. But HBK, the famous barbershop window promo where he kicks Marty Jannetty through the window. He kicks him and throws him. I don't even think he kicks him. But anyways, that HBK had the persona of a cocky Lothario, that he was Mr. Steal Your Girl. Like he was just, and the same thing. He was a good looking guy in a way that like women like swooned over him. He was just a fantastic wrestler. Undeniably one of the best wrestlers of all time. He a founding member of DX with Hunter Hearst Helmsley when it was initially him, Triple H in China, and then ravishing Rick Rude more or less. He, through a series of back injuries, he had to take a step back in wrestling for a few years, returned, had another series of great matches, and now is a trainer at NXT, the developmental, which really I can't think of a better person to teach these kids because we're getting to that point, with wrestlers, there's either who's considered the best is either Shawn Michaels or Bret Hart. And whatever one you say, you're right. I would just argue that what I would say though is that as a package, Michaels is probably a better entertainer, and that's why I think it's so great to have all these young talents learning from his tutelage, because I think that he has a lot of knowledge that most people just can't have. And Shawn Michaels has trained some of the greatest wrestlers in the world, most notably Bryan Danielson, or Daniel Bryan, but now wrestling in AEW, and his real name Bryan Danielson. Easily another one of the who will be regarded as one of the greatest wrestlers of all time. But so yeah, Shawn Michaels is a guy that I have to really sing his praises and go off on how great he has and how much he has changed. His influence can be seen on wrestlers to this day, right? There are, again, I'll have to, because I'm at that point where I think there are 4 wrestlers, 2 from the 2000s and two that really came in from the 2000s and 2 from the 90s that I think really shaped professional wrestling, or every wrestler that's wrestling today, and that would have to be Eddie Guerrero, Rey Mysterio Jr., Shawn Michaels, and Bret Hart. And those 4 guys really are the catalyst of where wrestlers are today, are because of the talents of those men. Shawn Michaels, not the biggest guy, but because and then he really came into his own when like steroids and muscle was king, and he shined and really just knocked everybody's socks off, but just how freaking good of a wrestler he was. And he took that to being a champion, and now he's a trainer, and I think that he is one of the best of all time.
All right, Tony, this is my last one. The Undertaker. The Undertaker's persona, spanning until his retirement, stood as one of the most safeguarded and iconic gimmicks in the wrestling world. From his remarkable debut, he etched himself into the annals of intimidation and terror, becoming a benchmark against which all eerie characters are measured. Throughout the 90s, he played a pivotal role in guiding WWE, anchoring events as a main event powerhouse, and reigning as a world champion. The name Undertaker resonates even with those on the fringes of wrestling fandom, or those not interested in the sport at all. It's a testament to the colossal impact he had as a performer. His popularity experienced a meteoric surge in the 90s, tracing back to his fabled unveiling at the 1990 Survivor Series. Can't believe it's been that long. Transitioning from aligning with Paul Bearer that guy was hilarious, to a riveting feud with Kane. He eventually ascended to lead the eerie Ministry of Darkness during the decade. While not perpetually at the forefront, The Undertaker was unequivocally the linchpin that unified WWE throughout the entirety of the 90s. His presence alone elevated matches to high-profile status, even if he wasn't always in the main event spotlight. Despite his in-ring dominance, his collection of WWE championships stood at a modest 3 as the decade drew to a close. So there you go, The Undertaker. Obviously one of the biggest wrestlers of the 90s. Tony, thoughts?
He had an undefeated streak in WrestleMania, just particularly WrestleManias, where he was famously ended by Brock Lesnar in 2014. Yeah, Brock Lesnar. Yeah, Undertaker is one of my personal favorites. I think that he's one of the most consummate professionals in professional wrestling, which is like why you never hear anything bad about him. There's like a famous quote from the guy who was Mr. Kennedy, who never really went anywhere, and he would say that there are 2 guys in WWE that are at the top of the mountain. One of them was Triple H, and one was The Undertaker. And they would say that Triple H would always throw rocks at you to keep you from the peak. And Undertaker was doing everything he can to bring everybody to the summit with him to say, look at this beautiful view we have. And I think, yeah, he's a guy the only guy I've ever heard him kind of backstage politic his way out of a job was a guy who slept with his wife. They always say he was the first guy to show up, last guy to leave. He'd watch every match. He'd study it. He would give feedback. Like, I think the only problem he has now is that now that he's finally talking, he kept, like, The Undertaker and Mark Calloway were you never really heard from Mark Calloway, But now that you were like hearing from Mark Calloway kind of shoot on things and talk about his personal opinion on stuff, we just go back to having the Undertaker kind of thing. But he's one of my favorites, and he's a guy who for years would constantly evolve himself. And that's wild especially for how long he had a career, especially a guy at his size to have that long of a career. He's one of the bigger men in wrestling to have, like, big men usually have to have a very limited move set because like they'll go out sooner. But he was constantly adding to his repertoire and adding more dangerous and innovative moves and things like that. And he really is one of the best to ever do it. I think that I understand why. Like, and his loyalty to the World Wrestling Federation is really paramount. He never left. They were offering big money. He stayed. He believed in the project, and like he stayed. And he made it what it is today. So I think that he really should be seen as a cornerstone of the WWF more than I think some other names that some bigger names that we've listed. I think that he's a pillar of that organization. And you're right, because he had a few title reigns, but they weren't very long. But he was just great at it. So I think that he really needs a lot of praises and propers for how good he is.
Is there anything you want to say regarding Shawn Michaels again? I might have stepped on you a little bit with my list on The Undertaker there. Was there anything further you want to say on Shawn Michaels? I think there's a couple things we probably should mention.
I know that you said I had to, because you get to a certain point, because you can't talk about Shawn Michaels without talking about Bret the Hitman Hart. Those two are intertwined. Their history is intertwined. I was going to say also, I know you said that this list is in no particular order, but I just figured as a Canadian, you're obliged to put Bret Hart as number one, and that's why he was there. But Bret Hart is, his gimmick was that he's the best there is, the best there was, and the best there ever will be. And he's probably right. I think that Bret Hart is, to this day, like I said, he's a guy, he wasn't my favorite growing up, but now when I watch his matches, I go back and watch him, he is so good at what he does. And what I was going to say is that for me, Bret Hart he began in Calgary, Alberta, at his family's Stampede Wrestling. Famously, Vince McMahon bought the entire territory just to get Bret Hart. That's how good Bret Hart was. Is that because he knew that he couldn't get him to leave his family's promotion. So he bought the family's promotion. That's how much he wanted Bret Hart. Bret Hart is genuinely started off with the Hart Foundation, him and his brother-in-law, Jimmy Anvil Neidhart, managed by Jimmy Hart, no relation. Then he transitioned into singles competition, mainly in the late 80s, early 90s, and he became the ace of that company for years, especially amidst the steroid scandal when they had to transition away from the big muscle men and they had to have these like leaner, smaller guys. Hart was carrying that company for a good 3-4 year stint, what they call, I think, the new generation era. There's that, like you can say in the history of the WWE, WWF logos, there's like a 4-year period where they had, before they went to the Attitude Era logo, they had like a flat kind of quirky logo. That was basically like Bret Hart was running the WWF at that time. Like he was carrying the whole company. Arguably one of its weakest points, but he made it worth watching. I think of him also as that he really tried to transition wrestling from a business to an art form. I feel like that's like the biggest thing he did is that he was an artist. He took on the family craft, but like I said, he was like a furniture maker. If like they were making chairs, like he would have actually made like he would have made an artisanal chair kind of thing. Like he really changed wrestling. And I think that he, to this point, is that he's the guy that, like I said, like the 4 most influential wrestlers, is that he really is the most influential. Everybody in wrestling now wants to be Bret Hart. They all try to wrestle like Bret Hart because Bret Hart was the best there is, the best there was, the best there ever will be. Obviously, we can't talk, when I say him and Shawn Michaels are intertwined, we can't not talk about the 1997 Montreal Screwjob in the, what arena is that? Is that the Labatt Arena?
Yeah, this is really a fascinating part of this is probably the biggest story in wrestling. I just don't think there's a bigger story than this, and I'm going to give you the mic again there, Tony, and let the uninitiated know, what is the Montreal Screwjob? Tell us. Walk us through it.
So in 1997, Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart were famously not getting along backstage at WWF. Bret Hart was promised a very lucrative 20-year contract by WWF, but they were in the wake of some financial troubles, and Vince McMahon advised Hart, who was offered a multi-million-dollar contract from WCW. Initially, Vince McMahon said that he was going to beat that contract, but then once the financials came in, he couldn't. He advised him to go and see if he could renegotiate that contract again, because he wasn't going to be in a position to actually honor the one he made with him. Hart agreed. He didn't want to, but he also said that he was going to do that, but he did not want to drop the title belt to Shawn Michaels, because at the time, him and Michaels were having a lot of animosity towards one another. It's funny thing about professional wrestling too is a lot of this is like a lot of guys are just like prissy divas, because it was like Hart just asked Michaels, I would drop the title for you, would you drop the title for me? And Shawn didn't answer, so he took that as like a sign of disrespect. He says, I won't drop it I'll drop it to anybody but Shawn Michaels. Drop it to Steve Austin, I'll drop it to Mick Foley. I do not want to drop it to Shawn Michaels, especially in Canada, because they were at a point too where this was like a really cool time in wrestling where like they had the Hart the Hart Dynasty. No, there was the Hart Foundation again, but this time it was Bret, his brother Owen, who almost should be I feel should be on this list, because Owen Hart is one of the best wrestlers of all time too. One of the greatest in-ring performers. I think that he's underappreciated. So it was them, British Bulldog, Jim the Anvil Neidhart, and then Brian Pillman, who passed away like 2 months prior to this on an accidental drug overdose. But they were wrestling as in America, they were the heels because they were talking about how much America sucks. It's a toilet. That's really where one of the places where the name One Big Toilet came from, was Bret Hart calling America a toilet. They were getting booed and accosted in the United States, but then they would go to Canada and they would just be gods. They were super over in Canada, and there's a lot of areas like you see that in wrestling where Philly's going to cheer for who they want, Chicago's going to cheer for who they want, and Canada's going to cheer for their Canadians. That's why I do love that there's always a good national recognition for Canadian wrestlers, and Bret Hart being the best, being the guy who, it was literally I said when I talk about it, who took this American parlor trick, the best way to really describe wrestling, right? He took this American carny business and tried to make it into an art form. So he's huge in Canada. So they're having this match for the world title in Canada between Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart. Bret Hart says he is under the auspices that he will win, and then he's going to drop the title the next night on Raw to somebody else, but he's not going to drop the title to Shawn Michaels in Canada. Shawn Michaels puts Bret Hart into the sharpshooter, and suddenly the bell rings. Shawn Michaels, new world champion. Bret Hart never tapped. He never signaled that he was ending the match. The theory is, and at this point, it's the veracity or the truthfulness of it, we'll never know, because everybody who was involved is going to remain tight-lipped. Was this a work? Was this a shoot? But it's largely believed that Bret Hart was screwed out of his title in Montreal on a false finish because he was leaving for WCW, and it created, when I was talking about that logo, this was one of the last times they used that little family-friendly logo because they put the scratchy WWF, is because this was really when they started pushing the DX, was really the kind of becoming the face of WWF. But in that time, Vince McMahon transitioned from, at this, he never really conveyed that he was the owner of the company on TV up until Bret Hart spat in his face at the end of the Survivor Series in 1997. And then the next day, Vince McMahon gives the Bret Screwed Bret promo. Or was it a week? Shortly after that, there's the Bret Screwed Bret promo. Vince McMahon on screen acknowledges that he's the owner of the World Wrestling Federation, thus the greatest villain in wrestling history. Mr. McMahon is born. We are now moving into this kicked off the transition on this. Is this real? Is this not? Reality bending, better attitude, or TV with attitude wrestling, and thus born the Attitude Era. Unfortunately, Bret Hart, I think that as brilliant as he was, he went to WCW, and he never had much of a career until an errant mule kick gave him a devastating concussion, which put a permanent end to his in-ring career in 2000.
Yeah, I really like Bret Hart, and I don't know why I just feel bad for him. I feel like that Wrestling with Shadows documentary, I don't think it painted him in a bad light, but it was just tough to watch, and it's just tough to see him literally screwed over. What are your thoughts on the documentary, too?
Yeah, and I think that's unfortunate because where he shone was that he was this brilliant in-ring technician. I think now he would have said he'd be a guy that would really benefit from wrestling. Like how wrestling is today is almost designed for a guy like Bret Hart to thrive. Because if he would probably he'd do gangbusters in AEW, and if he was bored there, he would be able to go to Japan and actually be fairly lucrative in New Japan wrestling. Where I know they'd wrestled a lot like at that time in those areas, but I think that right now the money is better for a guy like Bret Hart. And I wish that I think what's unfortunate is he's on like a Legends contract with WWE, but I feel like he has a lot to teach people. Also, though, if he can get out of his own way, I think one of his fatal problems is nobody will talk a better game. We all talk about how great Bret Hart is, but nobody talks about how great Bret Hart is more than Bret Hart. But he's the best, though. That's the one problem is that like he backs it up, and he's a guy who's constantly vindicated. He makes like an incendiary take, and then he ends up being right. So it's also like, like I said, I've said this on One Big Toilet a few times. Is like my idea of "I told you so" points is that the guy who can say "I told you so" the most should be the guy you're always listening to. And in wrestling, that happens to be Bret Hart.
Tony, I can't believe it. That is the end of the list. The wrestlers, we've talked about the top 10 wrestlers or biggest wrestlers of the 1990s. Incredible list, incredible discussion. Before we get to our picks, you're the guest. Do you want me to go first, or do you want to go first with the worst pick of the best wrestlers of the 1990s?
I would like to go after you, but before we do that, I just want to list off 2 honorable mentions that I feel that I don't want to go too big into it. But I feel that I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the contributions of, or just at least acknowledge Chris Jericho and Goldust as 2 of the most important. Goldust to me is the guy who's like, none of this would have happened if Goldust wasn't pushing the envelope in 1996, letting them know that there's a potential for edgier programming. And Goldust really was the catalyst. And I think that Dustin Runnels is a phenomenal person and a phenomenal wrestler. And I think that he needs the propers. Chris Jericho, also one of the greatest of all times. To this day, still one of the greatest wrestlers, still actively. Yeah, and he's wrestling in AEW and Ring of Honor right now, and he's still killing it. Yeah, so he's a guy I got to sing praises of. But yeah, let's hear your worst of the best, and then we'll go with mine.
This might surprise some people, and I understand he's well-loved by fans and by the people in the industry, but I just never got excited by The Undertaker. I just never did. I didn't like the whole undead gimmick. I didn't like the whole feud with his brother Kane. The Paul Bearer, woo! It was too mystical. You got people like Shawn Michaels and The Rock, and even Mankind and the sock was a little bit much, the power of that sock in people's mouths. But you got behind The Rock and Steve Austin and all that stuff. It felt a little bit more, obviously, it's scripted, but a little bit more real or realistic. But The Undertaker was a mystical creature. It was beyond the pale. So for me, I understand sports entertainment. I know it's all pomp and circumstance, but it just went beyond the whole he's dead and going to be buried alive and all this stuff. Now, I know he had an incredible match with Mankind. That was probably obviously the best moment of Undertaker's career because it was just a wrestling match, right? But the whole mysticism behind the character that we're supposed to believe this is an undead creature who can never be defeated, I had a hard time with that. And I think that's what really soured his character for me, despite him being a great personality.
That's a hot take. I will add to that is that because Undertaker is also very much the sports entertainer archetype, right? Because like I talk about, a lot of what we remember him is that feud with Kane was literally, like I said, I always make the undead cowboy wizard versus fire demon serial killer, where they're just shoot lightning bolts and like launching pyrotechnics. So a lot of what made Undertaker and Kane was a stage show. So I can actually understand where that's. I was going to say that, but that's a part of like actual soap operas, right? Is you watch The Young and the Restless, and it's like a bunch of rich people feeding on one another. Yeah, it's literally like a soap opera. Here's all the stuff grounded in reality, and then it's what's Luke going on? What's Luke doing over here? Oh, fighting a demon.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough regarding the soap opera aspect of the Kane and Undertaker stuff. I guess that's just went beyond the pale for me regarding storyline and believability. But I understand he was a crowd favorite, and I'm probably in the minority. But, okay, maybe it's just my age too. I was a little bit older during this time too. It was just too much for me to believe, sort of to believe the kayfabe of this undead creature. Okay, Tony, you've been the star of this episode. You've been an absolute incredible star of this episode, and we're all looking forward to hearing your worst pick.
I was gonna say, so for mine before that, I think I hinted at it, is that the mule kick that ended Bret Hart's career was from Bill Goldberg himself. Bill Goldberg, that's how dangerous he was. He famously ended the career, but Bill Goldberg is not my worst. But for me, because we talked about a guy who, through backstage politicking, through screwing people over, through constant mismanagement and ego, and whom I believe will be regarded because nostalgia is one of the most dangerous psychedelics and one of the worst poisons, is it really hides the evil of men. So for mine, and I've said this, is Hulk Hogan. Hulk Hogan is, to this day, Hulk Hogan is my least favorite wrestler, because Hulk Hogan, also, to begin, the only reason why Hulk Hogan was Thunderlips is because nobody knew how to get a hold of Superstar Billy Graham, who basically is who Hulk Hogan was imitating, and another wrestler turned actor named Jake Strong. So because these two guys were not able to be reached, they went with Hulk Hogan. So he was a big guy, but they weren't even looking for him. He wasn't the guy they wanted for star power. Hulk Hogan is a snake. Hulk Hogan has betrayed more wrestlers. He famously jumped ship from AWA to WWF, which collapsed WWF. During the steroids trial in 1992, he famously snitched on all of his colleagues. He jumped ship to WWF from WCW when the money wasn't going there for a bigger money contract. He famously always took fall off from wrestling. He never wrestled between September and January, when football was going to drive the numbers and viewership down. And then he would return and say, see, this is the kind of difference I bring to professional wrestling. His attitude and his backstage politicking in WCW led to the demise of that company. He almost did the same thing in TNA in 2010 when he went to TNA. He is a racist. He famously let his idiot son drive and put to the point where he put a young man in a car accident, and that person has now special needs. And then Hogan told his son that he must have done some bad things for God to punish him like this. Hulk Hogan, time and time again, has shown that he is a self-centered, self-promoting sociopath that has caused more damage than he is. So for all the great things we can all allege that Hulk Hogan just happened to be right place, right time for, is that for all the things that he can allegedly take credit for, were really the accomplishments of others, but all things he can really take credit for are the things that have made wrestling a worse place to be for the talent, especially when you get to, in the late 80s, Roddy Piper and Jesse Ventura having a few brushes with Hollywood. We're like, hey, we're getting exploited here. We should use we should have a union, right? Professional wrestlers famously are not represented there. Independent contractors, even they absolutely should not be. They're like, for the amount of money that they generate, they woefully do not get paid the amount they deserve. Sometimes you'll see guys on wrestling. These people are on TV to millions of people across the globe, and they're making less than you and I. Like Hulk Hogan, so Piper, Ventura were adamantly trying to start a wrestlers union. Hulk Hogan caught wind of it, was able to snitch to the boss, nipped it right in the bud. Hulk Hogan has never been there for the wrestlers. He's only ever been there for Terry Bollea, to the point where the line between who Terry Bollea and who Hulk Hogan is blurred to the point where I don't even think he knows who he is.
Oh man, this is the evidence you're laying down is hard to dispute, but come on, Hulkster. He told us to say our prayers and eat our vitamins, and then when he went Hollywood Hulk with WCW, it broke the hearts of kids everywhere. It shows the power of the Hulkster.
It did break the hearts of kids everywhere, but you know what? Like I said, that's the important thing, is that now you have to understand that, like I said, you should only have faith in people that prove themselves. And Hulk Hogan, as a man outside of the wrestling ring, will be regarded as wrestling's greatest villain.
This is all very revealing, and the stuff you're laying down on Hulk, I get it. It's hard to disagree, but my childhood fandom is just having a hard time with it. But the cognitive distance that my brain is going through right now. But what I love hearing is your love of Bret Hart has been an absolute revelation for me. I really appreciate that.
Obviously, if this was a best of the best, Bret Hart is going number one, but this is the worst of the best. And if there's anybody who, like, really, if you want anybody who's the definition of the worst of the best, it's none other than Hulk Hogan. I hate the man. You're right. I have a fatwa against the man.
Tony, I can't say just how amazing it has been having you on the show. You're an incredible voice. Your knowledge, of course, of wrestling is bar none. I think I've got another topic that I'd like to have you join. Maybe I'll tease it right now. It's the top 10 wrestling crimes or crimes in wrestling. If you want to come on again, I'd love to have you on again. I miss your show. I miss hearing your voice weekly. But maybe just to hear your voice, I'll have to have you come on my show is what I'm going to have to do.
Anytime. It's like this is. I told myself I would still do podcasting guests, especially if it's not like anything tangentially related to what I did on One Big Toilet, because I want to do like this kind of shit. Makes me so damn happy. So anytime you want me on, I'll be here with bells on, baby.
Get those bells ready, folks. And thank you so much, Tony. Again, remember, in front of every silver lining, there's a cloud. And today it was The Undertaker for Ryan. And for Tony, it was Hulk Hogan. Some hot takes for both of us, I think. Let us know what you think in the comments or send us an email. Thanks again to Tony, and we look forward to seeing you again.